Our second speaker for today is Professor Amman Madan. Amman has studied anthropology at Punjab University and sociology at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he works on the possibilities of an education for dialogue, fraternity, and justice. And he also anchors a network of researchers and activists working towards that. So I hope that we get to hear a bit more about the network, since a lot of us are trying to think about, how to collaborate and how to sustain collaborations. His areas of research include how education helps in dealing with conflicts, how it transforms societies, how it mediates social inequality. And he has worked on the educational challenges posed by the existence of different civic cultures and political philosophies. He has in the past been a research associate with the Eklavya Foundation, has taught at the Homi Bhabha Center for Science and Education and at IIT Kanpur. And he has also been visiting faculty at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences at Jawaharlal Nehru University and the Central University of Tezpur. He was a professor at the Azim Premji University in Bangalore for 13 years and is now in APU's Bhopal campus since 2023.
थैंक यू एंड अमित, आपको बहुत दिनों बाद देखा. बीच बीच में कभी फोन पे तो बात हो जाती थी, लेकिन देखा बहुत दिनों बाद. और आज भी मजा आया आपकी बातों को सुनकर. कुछ बातों को मैं सहमत हूं, कुछ पर शायद मैं थोड़ा सा अलग से कुछ कहना चाहता हूं. तो देखिए कहाँ बात जाती है. लेकिन एज ऑलवेज बहुत मजा आया. My talk will be around 4 educational challenges which are faced by those of us who want to work on education for the scheduled tribes and for all other less powerful groups also, less powerful groups. These are the 4 things I'll be talking about. The 4 things are, one is, I don't think we can avoid talking about cultural identity. I agree with Amit that we should not see that as the only thing to talk about, but we do have to talk about cultural identity, and therefore one educational question is, okay, what do we learn about our culture? What do the scheduled tribes learn about their own culture, and what do they learn about their own institutions, both cultures and institutions, their own? And this is necessary because it helps to build their strength. Without doing this, they become even more powerless. I don't want to make a blanket statement on this, but cultures and identities seem to empower, which is my second educational question, therefore. So we can't look at culture just in a blanket way, that education in their own culture, in their own institutions. We have to do some filtering, some refining on the basis of empowerment. So the second point is that there must be an emphasis on empowerment upon choosing those elements of culture, older cultures, which will increase their power in a situation which is of great inequality of power. So that's the second thing. We must talk about empowerment and use that to filter questions of culture. A third educational dimension is, other than their own culture, other than their own institutions, we also have to look at other cultures and other institutions, because members of the scheduled tribes can benefit from knowing more about these new social structures and cultures which are emerging around them. Amit gave many examples to show that they are actually now part of much larger systems. So that too has to be understood. Yeah. So it's not, I'm not saying we have a blanket acceptance either of the old culture or of the new cultures, new social structures, which they are now finding themselves surrounded by. I'm not asking about for a blanket acceptance of either. But there must also be a thinking about and creating new ideas, new knowledges, with the idea of empowerment again. And the last question I will talk about is that of who will do this? Who will take the lead who will actually go ahead and think about these things, creating those suitable kind of educational institutions, curricula, pedagogies, who will do this? These are the four kind of things I will talk about. Of course, there are so many more issues about education for the scheduled tribe, but I'll focus around these. And my um, the example I will talk through is I will draw from a study which Nupur Rastogi, Naveen Paswan, and I, we had together done a study. Uh, I don't know if you are here, Nupur and Naveen. Would you like to turn on your camera for a minute? Okay, I don't know you. I can't see you, but yeah, I hope you're there. Yeah. So yeah. So I'll draw from this study as an example to talk about these four issues. The um, the study was uh, trying to understand existing local cultures, and not about everything, but particularly how do adolescents deal with the issues that they are facing? Specifically, what are the ways of dealing with conflicts? Yeah. So the idea being that there are traditions and cultures which we need to understand, and then we have to also critically think about them. But to do this, I must first have a very careful understanding of what is the existing way. Now, the broader area in which this kind of work stands is that every society has to address one particular thing, which is how do you teach young people to become full members of your society? Yeah. Now, this includes big understanding and being part of politics, being part of the economy, being part of cultural activities, and taking decisions. Yeah. This is about creating a subjectivity of a grown-up person, which will have propositional knowledges, which will have procedural knowledges of a particular kind, which will have effective knowledges of particular kinds. Uh, so we must identify those. And uh, uh, um, the example I'm talking about is around how do people take decisions and how do they act in situations where there are dilemmas and conflicts. Yeah? For example, do I choose the benefit of my community, or do I choose the benefit of my workplace? Yeah, which may be a factory. Whose benefit do I look for? Uh, how to even understand institutions through which decisions are taken, regarding our lives. Uh, uh, there are many educational questions over here. For example, what do you teach? Do I teach loyalty to the tribe? Do I teach loyalty to the nation? Whom do I teach loyalty to? How do I teach is a very big question. We know that most societies which have not had a very extensive institutional place for schooling, they learn that methods of teaching and learning are through observation and imitation, not through reading textbooks or sitting in classes. So should I still try to teach in those ways through observation and imitation? Or should I try to teach through reading textbooks, for example? And if this area about growing up is so important, about growing up to become a full member, not just growing up, becoming a full member who's taking decisions now in my society, then uh, uh, what are the ways of teaching this? And there can be very different traditions of teaching this. Oh, yeah. The In certain kinds of societies where states are very important, where formal organizations are very important, this is called civic education, or citizenship education, or even sometimes called political education in certain kinds of societies. But when we are talking of the scheduled tribes, uh, we have to see it in a much larger way. We cannot see it only from the framework of the state. It can take a variety of forms. So that's what the example I'll be talking about. And if we are to teach this, traditions, how do we think about traditions from the point of view of empowerment? What else other than tradition do I need to teach? And who will teach this? Uh, Now, first about traditions and the complications in traditions. The one big complication immediately, as several people have mentioned, even Amit mentioned right now, was that there is a great diversity amongst the scheduled tribes. So if growing up to learn to take decisions has to be connected to my community, now that community can be very, very different. The scheduled tribes is a very wide range of communities. The political organization will range from very small bands. Bands are communities which don't have any formal leaders. So these are four categories which are common in anthropology. We use these terms: bands, what we technically call tribes, which is different from the common usage of tribes in India, but technically what we will call a tribe. The tribe will be one where there is some formal leadership. Bands have no formal leadership. Tribes have some formal leadership, but don't have inheritance of leadership. It doesn't go from father to son or father to daughter. It doesn't go like that. But there is some formal leadership. That technically we call that a tribe. Now see the complications. Which tradition do I teach? The third kind is what are called chiefdoms, which have inherited privileges, which have formal leadership, but have inherited privileges. And a fourth kind is what we call states. So a political organization in the form of states, of which we have also some examples in India of scheduled tribes having a tradition of states. The Gonds, for example, seem to have been such communities. Now, states have highly formal organizations, and are bureaucratized in their structure. The first three, now what I'm trying to illustrate is the challenges of teaching a tradition. The bands, the technically what we call tribes, and the chiefdoms, they all are based around informal relationships and kinship. Yeah. The state is based on formal relations. Yeah. So and especially within them also, in the band, leadership is present but is not formally identified, and therefore is highly diffused and participative. Everybody is an equal. Yeah. If anybody tries to appear to be a little special, a lot of pushback comes from the rest of the community. Is this what we want to teach? Yeah. If we want them to be part of communities, have the strength of the community, then this is the culture. It's what people have called reverse domination, where if anyone becomes prominent, the rest of the community suppresses them, and they have techniques of suppression. You make fun of people, you ignore, sometimes even beat up somebody who's trying to, be an upstart. The uh, tradition would mean teaching this. There are benefits to this. Uh, in the scheduled tribes, which have more organized structures, where particularly you have some kind of formal leadership, whether they are the technical tribes or the chiefdoms, their power is concentrated around kinship, particularly around clans and phratries. Here, uh, learning to be part of a particular kinship group is very important. And so, is that what we should promote? They may even have particular myths and rituals and customs which show that this clan has special privileges, and that may actually be very important for the political organization, because such mythologies are what create uh, the special purpose of that particular clan and helps to integrate the rest of the society. Do we teach that? Do we teach that, yeah, these people are special? You know, there can be, uh, I will hesitate to say that in principle we should always be against any kind of inequality. If it empowers the community, maybe we have to think about it differently. And we should say, yes, maybe this is a tradition which we should accept, because it's empowering over there. In a particular situation where anything else will disempower them, this empowers. So one possible principle, I'm not saying this is the final thing, one possible principle of choosing between traditions is empowerment in a particular situation. There can be many kinds of variations. I'll just mention one common institution, which is not there in bands, but is there in the tribes as well as the chiefdoms, which is they will have some kind of a panchayat. which is a community-specific panchayat, but it is also all male. I don't know of any panchayat, which is traditional panchayat, which includes women in them. But they'll have panchayats, all male bodies. And these periodically meet to pass judgment. So these are their institutions. The way states will have other kind of institutions, these are their institutions. Learning to grow up and hold on to an identity and also learn the strength. There are strengths to this also. Would mean learning about how to be a good member of a panchayat, which is an all-male body. Now, they don't usually have formally codified systems, uh, but there are a lot of cultural codes which are guiding behavior. So learning to grow up means learning those cultural codes, which are guiding actions, values, norms, choices. All of these are being guided over there. Yeah. So there's a lot of variation. So one clear implication which comes out is we cannot have, if we want to uh, empower through tradition, if we want to empower through culture, we can't have a centralized way of dealing. You can't have one textbook. There must be highly decentralized institutions, highly decentralized ways of developing curricula and teaching learning materials. One just it just won't work. At the same time, so decentralization seems to be a requirement over here if we are going to work like this. At the same time, because there's so much variation, when the classic thing which happens when you have so much variation, then there must be some way of comparing and choosing. One principle of choosing I've already suggested, which is empowerment, but there can be other. There may be certain values, norms which we would rather prefer, and use those to choose. But those also then need to be clearly articulated and spelled out. But uh, clearly there is there is an importance of critical reflection upon older practices. Yeah. And then articulating what of the traditions do we keep, what of the traditions do we not keep. Do we want an all-male panchayat or something else? So what is the principle that I'm pushing and who will support such a principle? Another dimension of this is that I think Amit put it very nicely, the many examples he was giving of Adivasi youth who are now traveling all over central India, even going to southern India to work, is that uh, the lives of the scheduled tribes are now being penetrated more and more by universalistic institutions, like the state and the market. They are there. I can't wish them away. And these are operating at a scale. These are different from the institutions and also the ideas and cultures of the scheduled tribes. They are different because, among other things, they operate at a scale which is much greater than the panchayat. The state operates at a much larger scale. The market operates at a much larger scale, which gives it also so much power. Now, if this is to be engaged with, now, while talking about identity, while talking about tradition and not giving up on that, there must also be an engagement with these systems, yeah? Which means moving away from, for example, not in every domain should I have only my old kinship-based political organization. I must learn to also be part of universalistic political organizations. And I must learn the cultures and structures of those institutions also. This is where this seems to be taking us. The Now, to illustrate this question of how do I grow up to be part of as an adult, an active member taking decisions. I'll take up this study by Nupur and Naveen, in which they interviewed adolescents from 6 villages, two primarily Santal populated villages, two primarily OBC populated villages. This is all in Jharkhand, rural Jharkhand, and two which had a mix of Santals and OBCs. Through this example, I hope to show that their cultural ways of taking decisions, resolving disputes, uh, dealing with opponents, work very well in small communities, but don't work well the moment they are in very large scale communities. They have to learn something else there. Yeah. And this raises questions about what to preserve and what to change. If it's a structure and if it's the cultures which are working well in particular structures but will not work in other kind of structures, we have to rethink things while holding on to identities because they give strength. So Nupur and Naveen's method had been to tell stories to these young people about conflicts between different members of the family, and then asking, if you were there, what would you do? How would you resolve this? What would your strategy be? Now, an analysis of their responses suggests these three or four major patterns which are coming out of particular history, social structures, and cultures. The first pattern is that the the basic idea is that whatever be our dispute, eventually we will all become a happy community again. Everything will get fixed, and we will be back in a relationship of affection, and uh, positive social relationships will be restored, which is very different as an orientation, from how the state works, which is very different from how markets work. But here, whatever be the issue, they're living in small houses in villages surrounded by scrub and fields, and they are tied together by bonds of kinship and community. And they've grown up there. All their life they've been there. This is where they always want to come back to. And there's the idea that these relationships are permanent. You know, I may go to study, I may go to work, but I come back. This is where I am all about. This creates an effective orientation as to uh, when I'm in a dispute with somebody, what all can I do and how far can I go? Even if I've been deeply wronged, how far can I go? Leave aside temporary moments of madness of anger. But whatever strategies I'm using, this is my community. I have to come back over here. There's a very distinct emphasis on maintaining and restoring affections. This is, as I said, in sharp contrast with a formal and dispassionate spirit, which we see in formal organizations, where this is a law and this is what we have to implement, period. So here is a tradition and here is a challenge to it. Now, this tradition has many strengths. This is a pattern not just amongst the Adivasis of India, around the world. This thing has been noted in small scale societies, where the purpose of dealing with an issue is, I have to restore social life, I have to restore norms and affections. I don't want the logical satisfaction. I am attaining abstract principles like justice, truth. That's not my purpose. It's I have to restore a relationship. This is not necessarily done by talking about justice, very importantly. These are the local cultures. They don't necessarily talk about justice. Justice very occasionally, if ever, appears. Very rarely does ideas like that appear. Universalistic principles like equality, justice, freedom, you know, they're not really being made use of over here. The most important ways of achieving sociality, of restoring bonds, is through somehow we have to get consent from the others, which can be done by bullying, by shouting, by scolding, by persuading, and sometimes by avoiding situations. Even the idea of having a dialogue, in which there is, by a dialogue, I mean something where there is a mutual convergence of values. And I have conversations to achieve that. Very rarely does this appear. The majority is we must have consent, but consent is by scolding and persuading. Uh, and let me come to that. So the first thing I'm saying is the way of dealing with issues is I have to somehow restore social bonds. How is this done? By scolding. The most common way of talking about an issue is we start by scolding talk. ऐसे कैसे किया? ये कोई करने का तरीका? तुमने ऐसे क्यों किया? This kind of scolding talk. Very rarely do you find an attempt to, it happens, it's not rare, it's not absent, it happens, but it's less frequent. That I start by asking, by trying to understand why did the other person do this? What were the other person's goals? What are the other person's values? This is quite infrequent. The default is start by scolding. And so I put up a firm and aggressive demand, and other party yields. If it doesn't yield, if it yields, then the term is used कि मामला सुलझ गया. This is resolved. This is, the knot has been unknotted. So I try to coerce, and if they yield, problem is solved. The idea of dialogue is not present over here. Very rarely did we find some example of people having dialogue. If the person did not yield, then this escalates. Yeah. And I'll come to what happens when it escalates up to a certain point. Then they have a way of capping their escalation. It works as a system. These are methods, and there's a way of capping the escalation, which works fine in these communities, but don't work when you move to a big city and are working in a factory over there. And that is the challenge then. So coercion, scolding talk is the default. Another default is they use the word हम समझाते हैं, but समझाते means थप्पड़ मार के समझाते, you know. So it's an affection. It's a strategy of affection, you know, that I will try to somehow persuade my opponent. It's an affectionate way of trying to get the other person to agree, but violence is part of it. So especially as an older person, I will slap somebody and say, हाँ मैं उसको समझा दिया. This again is a coercive strategy, though it has a very strong feeling of affection on this. Again, this is not a dialogue. While they're saying samjhana, which appears to be like explaining, but it's not a dialogue. It's not having a conversation, trying to understand, or a collective cognitive processing. It's not. Yeah. Instead, it may work through appeals to moral duty, by saying, this is how you should be behaving, this is how you are, don't you think you should be behaving like this only? Or it may be through bullying or threatening and maybe some violence. All of this will be done through an attitude of care and love in the family, you know, using the family model in this. But ultimately, this is also a strategy of coercion, since there's little effort to understand the other person or to engage in a conversation with them. So these two strategies. A third major strategy is, of course, withdrawing. So either one coerces or one withdraws. One does not have a dialogue. Very few examples we found of having a dialogue. The withdrawal was done through a calculus of power, through a calculus of kinship relationships. This is my uncle, this is my father, this is my elder brother, you know, this kind of a thing. So, and then they say, okay, रहने दो, ठीक है, क्या कर सकते हैं, you know, what can you do? You let it go. So one withdraws and one yields. I'm repeating this again and again. Notice no dialogue, very little dialogue over them. Now, how this gets capped? If there's a situation where my default is to be coercive or to withdraw, why does this not lead to, you know, eternal wars between people? It doesn't, because of a particular cultural practice and an institution. I'll come to the cultural practice again, which is third parties begin to intervene. Then whenever there's a quarrel, people don't sit and watch it. People intervene. This cultural practice caps the conflicts and keeps them from spiraling out of control. Yeah. They will do a number of things to talk about things and persuading groups of both sides and say, okay, calm down. You know, don't let it get out of the out of bounds. And in this, there is, when things do escalate to a certain point, that's a particular institution which is taken resort to, which is sometimes called the Baithak or the Panchayati, in which a number of relatives and neighbors will all sit and discuss the quarrel. This is an all-male body, and the head of the village, the Majhi, will be present over there. You know, everything will be discussed at great length, and everybody will have their say. And at the end, the purpose is The purpose is again not like a code to say this is right, this is wrong, or to do formal moral reasoning, this is correct, this is wrong. The purpose is again to restore norms, and the belief is also that people will tell the right thing over here, because as somebody said, you don't want to make enemies of everybody by telling the wrong things over there. You'll generally tell the right thing. Yeah. So the majority of the male adolescents said that this will be my first preference. If things are going out of control, that's where it should go. I would rather not go to the police and the courts. That's very expensive. They beat you, they take money. I would rather go to the panchayat. So here is an institution which is used to resolve issues, but which has its issues. It has its own problems. Yeah. The Now this system. Now let me try to put some things together. Yeah. So uh, 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 the overall system, therefore, of dealing with issues, which is a necessary thing when you're growing up, you have to learn. And this is what all politics is all about. Is this system over here is primarily aimed at restoring sociality, restoring bonds, and it is done through quite vigorous contentions, both of the scolding kind and the persuasive kind. Uh, there is also the expectation of withdrawal or yielding. People are supposed to withdraw, people are supposed to yield. And when this does not happen, then the whole system is controlled from spiraling out of control by the interventions of relatives, neighbors, or by the Baitak or Panchayati meetings. Uh, through these interventions, conflicts are contained, and the primary emphasis is maintaining social norms. As I said, there were only occasional examples we got of people trying to have dialogues, trying to understand each other's point of view, or trying to find creative solutions, which would be through listening to each other, trying to find creative solutions which would be acceptable to all parties. Very few we got doing this. Now, in the academic world, it is a truism to say that moral action should be based on the ability to reason about moral matters and to choose between better and worse actions. The Constitution of India, and much of what we learn as Western political philosophy, it mentions principles like freedom, equality, justice. These should be guiding principles for our actions. However, in these kinship-based societies, these processes, these concepts are virtually absent in the narratives of the adolescents that we spoke to. They were using moral principles. It's not that they were not using, they were using many moral principles. But those moral principles were coming from the domain of kinship and gender. Yeah? And these were setting the norms for behavior. Hierarchies were present and hierarchies were unquestioningly accepted. The hierarchies of family and kinship were accepted. Yeah? So the uncle had to be spoken to be politely. Yeah? In quarrels between siblings, the older was justified in scolding, maybe even slapping the younger child. Though the reverse cannot be done. So there are moral principles being used over here. Elder sisters can harshly scold, even slap a younger sister, but not a younger brother. They can't slap a younger brother. Yeah? The ideas of fairness and of receiving one's dues were important principles. However, these depended upon maintaining sociality and upon also the practicality of success over here. So moral reasoning is being done, but it's a different kind of moral reasoning than the kind which the constitution's liberal, socialist, communitarian foundations would imply. The the differences, include important assumptions, values, institutions, and processes. So what do I do then? When I have to want to work educationally over here, what do I do? Let me come back to those four questions. What traditions, empowerment, what about other cultures? Do I also teach about other cultures, other institutions? And I'll just talk about, given the time constraints, I'll talk about just three or four things. The uh, this emphasis, firstly, this emphasis that the purpose of dealing with a conflict is not to win, is not to establish truth, but to establish, again, conviviality, to establish bonds. This is a very interesting contrast with the punitive and impersonal frameworks which many contemporary institutions are taking. And actually, several schools are trying to learn from this now. Several institutions of justice are trying to learn from this now around the world. That underlying this is the principle of care and a principle of ultimately being responsible for each other. Holding on to this emphasis is valuable. Even in the middle of migrating to other parts of the country and the kind of neoliberal development which is happening, even then, such principles, many of us will feel that these are valuable principles to hold on to. Yeah. The institutions of justice are not supposed to stop caring for other people's well-beings, for each other's well-being. It's a responsibility to everybody that I care for others. You know, and of course, in this, the worst kind of punishment possible is social boycott. Social boycott, see, is I no longer care for you. That's a social boycott. It's the worst punishment. But this approach of caring, of feeling responsible for others, and whatever I'm doing, ultimately I come back to that. This is an attractive principle which one must learn from traditions and carry forward. The panchayat, the panchayati or Baitak also provides a very interesting institutional format. As I said, there are people who are today working on restorative justice in schools, for example, and other institutions are trying to learn from this. Their focus is on healing and on reasserting norms, not primarily on punishment, not primarily on revenge. Yeah, the focus is on healing over here. This too people are trying to learn from, and this is really worth carrying forward. At the same time, there are problems in older cultures. For example, this widespread emphasis on coercion and forcible persuasion, thappad maar ke samjha diya, forcible persuasion, and this general underplaying of dialogue is a matter of concern. This only works so long as there is a supportive environment which caps it before serious harm can be done. If there's no supportive environment, suppose they're going and working in a factory, then that supportive environment is not present. So it will not work the moment they start moving around. So what strategies of conflict resolution can we teach? Which will work for them there as well. Yeah. How does one learn to have calmer conversations, which are problem-solving conversation, not just have scolding talk or forcible persuasion talk, but actually reasonable talk? How does one do that? How does one have dialogues? There is an increasing importance of this, especially in the kind of large-scale complex societies that they are becoming part of now. Now, learning that listening is not a sign of weakness, is important. So yeah, the one also, I mean, there are many things, more things perhaps which need to be also learned. For example, restraint. When something wrong happens, I hold on for a minute and I don't immediately react. There are benefits to this also over here. These are particularly clear the moment one starts, and their importance becomes one moment one sees that they have to move around in a much larger society, which is not their own community surrounding them all the time to take care of things. Somebody else may be there and it'll spiral completely out of control. So how do I handle that? There are also issues with the panchayat. I've already mentioned that it's an all-male body, and this limits its grasp of many issues. It limits its grasp of a lot of kinship-related issues over there. On the other hand, it permits also collective strategies, which can be very valuable because they balance out some power inequalities, but it has these problems over here. Perhaps this institution also needs to be critically looked at and improved upon. I'm not saying rejected, improved upon. over here. At the same time, my last two or three things I want to say. At the same time, the non-tribal institutions, which are all around them and are so powerful, they need to be systematically understood and must systematically learn how does one have leverage in those institutions. How do I have leverage in those institutions? Which means learning their structures and learning how to access them. Learning how to mobilize, come together so as to have leverage, not just in one's own institutions, but in their institutions or other institutions also, non-tribal institutions also. Since these institutions are dominated by other cultures, they are dominated by other languages, there is a need to pay special attention to learning those languages as well. And how does one influence them? These cannot be learned by the older pedagogies of participation, observation, copying pedagogies, which are the typical pedagogies of the less hierarchical societies. We do need to therefore think about special efforts to make special institutions, schools, colleges, to which teach the ways of power in these larger uh, institutions and the state-based political system. This will, as I said, include not just learning. I'm not talking about just memorizing rights and duties. I'm also talking about uh, learning to organize, learning to consolidate one's strength, learning to use identity as a way of getting one's strength, so that greater leverage is the result in the state and other formal institutions. So yeah, the because more and more of these young men and women, these boys and girls, are going to be moving around to other places, they will be now in more and more multi-ethnic situations. And here again, learning, understanding, and applying universalistic principles becomes valuable. Yeah. Principles like equality, I need to now think about in a different way than it is thought of as equality only within my community. Even in my community, there's a hierarchy, but we are equal, but within the community, we are equal. What does equality mean when you have a multi-ethnic situation? It's a new kind of idea. Yeah. We have to talk about that. We have to think about that. What does equality, freedom, fairness, these universalistic principles, which were never fully universalistic, which they were never truly really universalistic, but they are, how do we think of them in a multi-ethnic situation? Yeah. This might also lead to some well-needed criticism and rethinking about kinship principles, like the relative positions of men and women. Uh, Let me close by reiterating that we need to work carefully upon identifying what needs to be preserved, which languages that we want to teach, what needs to be preserved in. We also need to very carefully think about what needs to be modified and what needs to be added. You can't modify it because it wasn't there. It has to be added. Yeah? And so as to have greater empowerment. And part of these become have greater leverage in these new social systems which are historically emerging. Not be pawns in them, but to be reflective, collective moral agents in these new systems. All this, now, the requirements for this, who will do this? This does call for people who understand both the scheduled tribes as well as the other systems. Otherwise, we can't have this learning. If I just understand one, I can't do the other. If I understand only the other but not this, I can't work again over here. We need to systematically understand both, and then try to do things. And this cannot be done, of course, in libraries. It has to be done in conversations with communities and by a process of trial and error, trying out things and seeing are they helpful or not. Who will do this? The Clearly the people, the organizations and individuals who identify as Adivasi or the scheduled tribe will have the greatest motivation to act on this. At the same time, I don't think people can be reduced to their social locations. Uh, there may be others also who don't identify as scheduled tribes, but at least identify as people who support fairness, people who identify as those who support freedom, equality, the kind of things Amit was talking about. They may be motivated to act, so as to rethink what goes by the name of citizenship education. We have to rethink that. It's a vast task. I'm not very optimistic about state institutions right now, given the way power is working and how they are tilting more away from disempowered and marginalized communities. Perhaps there may be some, of course, even within state institutions, there may be some enlightened individuals, some enlightened factions who may show some initiative. But I have greater hope in NGOs. I have greater hope in intellectuals at the fringes of the university system. I don't have great hope from hardcore university intellectuals because they are not interested in this. But perhaps people at the fringes may have the motivation to do things on this. Perhaps they will build those curricula, they will build those teaching learning materials, the pedagogies which are called for, and the teacher trainings, and be able to work in multiple languages, languages which people can understand. Yeah. And they will have to be backed up by community organizations and social movements. Because remember that knowledge is never spoken alone. It's always social. It's always sociological. There must be people supporting this. When I see the example, I'll just stop by saying when I see the example of the Adivasi Munetra Sangam, for example, in the Nilgiris district, Ramdas Rama had spoken here, or when I see the work of Bhasha and the many networks that they are building. So I see in them an understanding of the issue, and I see in them perhaps the ability to build a greater network and greater power to be able to do things. The It's when we have an empathic and also a critical assessment of Adivasi cultures and institutions. That's when we can actually begin to consolidate new and empowering directions for the future. Yeah, I'll stop at this.